Welcome to an incomplete and utter history of Unitarian Universalism, hastily designed and annoyingly narrated by me, the Reverend Kimberly Davis. Because it is a living history, things have happened since this was recorded in April 2023. Now, this is indeed an incomplete history, more of a survey, in fact. But sometimes it's helpful to have a broad survey, to understand who we are now and what we're on about. There's no need to memorize, there'll be no quiz, but hopefully you'll hear some intriguing themes and maybe some puzzling ideas, and perhaps someone or something in this history might pique your interest. So, where shall we begin? Let's begin with Jesus. No, wait, before that, let's begin in the religion that Jesus comes from, the religion of the Judeans and the Israelites, the religion which would become Judaism. On our timeline, you are here. So, in Judaism at this time, which is the 1st century in Palestine, religion has been mostly consolidated at the temple. But because people are living all around the region, folks are starting to have local worship in house synagogues. The conflict between one big temple and a bunch of small congregations in an occupied territory is really where our story begins. So Jesus is there at that time, and his ministry is out among the people, and it's one of love and kindness and justice. He's talking to people on the outskirts who are struggling to be faithful where they are, struggling in the oppression by the Roman occupiers, and let's not forget that that oppression is supported by the temple priests. This is ultimately why Jesus is a problem and has to be dealt with. Jesus was the original heretic. Now, after Jesus dies, there are many ideas about who Jesus is. Many ideas about God, about salvation, about resurrection. And so in those first couple of 100 years after Jesus dies, where we are right now in our timeline, we find that people are arguing about what is true and what is right and what is doctrine. So let's go to 325. Church leaders are meeting in a place called Nicaea, and they have a big council, the Council of Nicaea. And they're fighting about doctrine and truth and the nature of Jesus and God and the Holy Spirit. On one side is a guy named Arius who understands that Jesus is maybe divine and maybe important, but isn't God. And on the other side, a cleric named Nicholas, who becomes a saint and who becomes Santa Claus, who apocryphally gets in a fist fight with Arius over the doctrine of the Trinity. Well, Nicholas wins. The Trinity wins. And that statement of the Trinity is still in the Nicene Creed today, and it becomes the Orthodox. So our guy Arius is a heretic. So already we're beginning to hear hints of things that are a bit like us. By the 5th century, Theodorus the atheist talks about universal salvation, that all humans are saved. In the 8th century in Ireland, Clement declares that Christ restored all of the damned and is subsequently stripped of his priesthood. New ideas continue to crop up as the Roman Empire gives way to wars, migration, conquest, feudalism, and eventually a Renaissance. People begin questioning what the church has actually been doing for the last 1,000 years, mostly crusades and inquisitions by the look of it. But before you know it, Johann Gutenberg has invented movable type, books are being published, it's 1502, and Joseph finds, Martin Luther suggests that they talk about a few things that have been bugging him. 95 things, in fact, which he supposedly nails on the door of the place they're having this next council in Wittenberg, which doesn't exactly go well for Luther. Except it does, because once he's excommunicated, he is free to actually explore what the Bible says and means for others. He's also free to marry, and write an incredible number of hymns and essays and a few tracts about how awful the Jews are because they wouldn't agree with him. But because he's exploring the Bible and exploring theology and having these conversations, and people are starting to read, Europe goes wild with people not following the Catholic Church doctrine and working on reforming the church. Perhaps most notably, John Calvin. Yes, John Calvin, who believes that everybody's going to heaven if they've already been chosen, but you still have to be good so you don't lose your spot. And remember that everybody is born depraved, they're a sinner, they're terrible, and they're all going to hell, except for those that are elect and act right. Oh, and that Trinity thing is a really important idea, and don't you dare question it. Which a Spanish upstart named Michael Servetus does, and shows up on Calvin's doorstep in Geneva. Well, at least his book on the errors of the Trinity does anyway, and Calvin has big problems with this. So Calvin writes to Servetus, "You're full of crap, you're heretical, stop writing to me." But Servetus keeps writing to him and suggesting that he come to Geneva to debate Calvin. Calvin says, "Don't do it, because what you're saying is heresy, and I'm the man in charge, and I will make sure you're punished." Well, Calvin did dare him. So Servetus goes to Geneva, and Calvin has Servetus tried as a heretic and burned at the stake. Michael Servetus dies over the Unitarian heresy in 1553. Meanwhile, Lelio Socini has come to Geneva too, and Calvin has welcomed him with open arms for his new ideas about reform, until Calvin learns that Socini and his nephew Faustus have developed a Christian Unitarianism, and, well, Calvin is having none of it. But instead of being tried as heretics and burned at the stake, the Socinians head toward Transylvania, where John Sigismund is king, and recognizes that there can be room in his kingdom for multiple religious beliefs. In 1567, Giorgio Biandra and David Farenc, who we now often call Francis David, publishes The False and True Knowledge of God, which is a history of anti-Trinitarian thought from Arius to Servetus. Famously, Ferenc said, "We need not think alike to love alike," except he didn't. That was Methodist founder John Wesley a couple hundred years later. But the sentiment is certainly Ferenc's. In 1568, King John signs the Edict of Torda, which is the first declaration of religious tolerance. King John declines to name any one religion as an official state religion, and in 1571, Unitarianism receives official recognition in Transylvania. Over the next 100 years or so, there's a flurry of folks writing on various aspects of Unitarian thought and universal salvation. Most of them are getting into trouble, including Lelio's nephew Faustus, and an influential German Universalist named Jacob Boehme, and John Biddle, the father of English Unitarianism, whom Oliver Cromwell could have executed, but decided just to exile because he kind of liked the guy. Now, one of the products of all of this in the 16th and early 17th century is that not only do we have more liberal groups like Unitarians cropping up, we also have people taking a much harder line, namely Puritans. A group of these Puritans, numbering about 40, decide to leave England because it is far too lax in its Christianity. They tried the Netherlands for a decade or so, but that didn't even work out so well, so they joined forces with some merchants who had already been trading in North America. Together they hop on a boat called the Mayflower.
They set off from Plymouth and landed in Plymouth. How lucky is that?
As their numbers grow, they establish villages and towns and, of course, churches on the land of the Wampanoag. And the more churches they plant, the more they realize they need some way to organize themselves without government interference. In 1648, they gather in Cambridge and write that Cambridge Platform. This is the founding document of our congregational polity. It says that we must be in relationship with one another, and care for one another, and call each other into account, even as we govern ourselves. Now, there's a lot in the Cambridge Platform that is about excommunication and requirements for who can actually be members and full members and partial members. And that stuff gets pretty in the weeds and fairly dicey. We don't like to talk about that part much, but what we do like to talk about is the self-governance of each congregation and their relationship to each other, what we might today call a covenant. In England, the monarchy is restored. There is wealth and more throughout Europe. In the colonies, there is a combination of wildness and fervent religious belief. And with more people coming to colonize, there is more social and religious unrest too. However, there's also more space to be what the church would call a heretic. In 1742, George de Benneville and Johann Sauer published the first German-language Bible published in America. They set the passages most favorable to Universalism in bold typeface. In 1757, James Relly, a Methodist minister in England, preaches universal salvation in opposition to John Wesley and becomes a former Methodist minister. However, Relly influences John Murray, who was also excommunicated from the Methodist Church for preaching universalism. Meanwhile, on our side of the pond, Thomas Potter builds a chapel in Good Luck Harbor, New Jersey, in response to the Bonneville's preaching. He builds this with the conviction that if he built a chapel, a preacher would come. Some dozen years later, and many preachers later, John Murray shows up and preaches there. And by 1774, Murray has not only committed himself to preaching universalism throughout the colonies, he eventually settles in Gloucester, Massachusetts, to form the first Universalist society in what would become the United States. Around the same time, Theophilus Lindsay sets up the first Unitarian chapel in London, where Joseph Priestley becomes a Unitarian. Priestley writes the Institutes of Natural and Revealed Religions, which becomes the standard for Unitarians in both England and America. Joseph Priestley comes to Philadelphia in 1791, where his preaching led to the founding of the first Unitarian Society, and somewhere along the way here discovers oxygen. Let's pause for a moment. When we talk about that early universalism, we need to understand that they understood that there had to be a time of restoration between death and heaven, that there still had to be some atonement of sins committed on earth. And honestly, Unitarians didn't really grok that whole universal salvation thing. Their focus was the unity of God as a biblical stance and our God-given reason as our tool for understanding the Bible and God and faith. So as the American Revolution begins, we're starting to see hints of the faith we know here now in America. Now, coming out of that time are Enlightenment ideas of liberty for some, a reliance on autonomy for some. But we do see a great amount of aspiration, a desire to help lift all boats, and a drive to freely express our religions. By 1782, we see King's Chapel in Boston choosing to ordain James Freeman, which is the first example of congregational authority. King's Chapel becomes the first openly Unitarian church in America. In 1805, two important things happen. First, the very Unitarian Dr. Henry Ware becomes chair of Harvard Divinity School, and Universalist minister Hosea Ballou publishes a treatise on atonement, which called for the use of reason and interpreting scripture like the Unitarian, but also promoted a death and glory salvation, meaning no waiting period or restoration or fees are needed because God is love. Simply, God is love. While, of course, also forming the foundations of modern Universalist thought, a treatise on atonement was also the first overtly anti-Trinitarian book published by an American author. The Unitarian controversy grew, and soon anti-Trinitarians were called Unitarian as an epithet. In 1819, at the ordination of Jared Sparks at the Unitarian Church of Baltimore, William Ellery Channing claimed the name Unitarian and declared very clearly what is meant by Unitarian Christianity. That sermon, which we call the Baltimore Sermon, forms the foundations of modern Unitarian thought. And here on our timeline is where we are. Now I want to pause again for a little theological summary. By this point, Unitarian theology centers in one circle that says there's no biblical basis for the Trinity and the fact that there is only one God. Universalist theology centers in a different circle that says God is benevolent and seeks reconciliation and harmony and not eternal punishment. And both movements understand direct experience, the use of our reason to understand the Bible, and that we must live out the call of Jesus' ministry and not just be followers of a Jesus-centered religion that has very little to do with the work we are called to do. Now, this time, the early 19th century, is often called the Second Great Awakening because with religious freedom comes religious fervor and new ideas. With the opening of the Erie Canal in New York State, suddenly there's an easy way to go west. And soon, religious speakers of all sorts travel the Erie Canal, pitching tents along the way and preaching their message in an area called the Burnt Over District. Because, well, a preacher would come and the folks would catch fire, and another preacher would come and folks would catch fire again. It is in large part thanks to the Erie Canal and this time period that Universalism begins to grow, and at one point it is the largest denomination in the United States. But the Erie Canal also allows religion to move west. More on that soon, because we need to go back to Harvard and talk about Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson was the Unitarian minister who noted that intellectualism was getting in the way of true religious experience. And Harvard Divinity was the hotbed of that religious intellectualism. In 1838, he preached the graduation address at Harvard Divinity, which set off a whole new way of thinking about religious experience, which we now know as transcendentalism. While neither Emerson or his friend Henry David Thoreau coined the term, it did spawn the idea of direct experience of awe and wonder, and the exploration of religions outside of the Abrahamic ones, causing a new fervor and new engagement in nature, spirit, and expression. Unitarian minister Theodore Parker understood this connection to individual experience, and indeed individuals meant that the answer to social problems like slavery, poverty, and peace was not thoughts and prayers, but direct reform and action. The subsequent years saw a great number of reform movements and varying flavors of anti-slavery, abolition, labor rights, women's rights movements. In Universalism especially, this also allowed space for women to become prominent and be ordained. By 1863, Universalist Olympia Brown was the first woman fully recognized by a national organization with full fellowship as an ordained minister. But of course, here we are in the Civil War. Now, Unitarians and Universalists fought or were otherwise highly involved. Clara Barton founded the Red Cross to help wounded soldiers. Thomas Wentworth Higginson helped found the Port Royal experiment, which housed and educated those running away from slavery. And he commanded the 1st South Carolina Volunteers, the 1st Black Regiment in the U.S. Armed Forces. And Julia Ward Howe, a friend of Abraham Lincoln, was inspired to write a poem called the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which was soon set to a well-known tune and became a prominent song for the Union. After the war, the United States sees parallel expansions of Unitarianism and Universalism. Mary Augustus Safford leads a group of women westward to found fellowships in the Plain States, bringing a more pastoral approach, making their churches extensions of the domestic hearth, expanding the traditional role of women beyond the home and into the church. This Iowa sisterhood was active from about 1880 to around 1930, and as westward expansion continued and more people settled westward and cities grew, those congregations began to call men. No longer needed as ministers, most of the women of the Iowa sisterhood turned to community organizing, which was needed because the need for social reforms was even greater. In part, this grew out of the expansion of industrialization and, of course, the expansion of America across the continent. But it was also influenced by social Darwinism, a corruption of Charles Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, This was a belief that natural selection meant that some people were better and fitter than others. Christians around the country turned back to Jesus' lessons on care, compassion, and inclusion, and in the early 1900s had spawned what is known as the social gospel movement. Social gospelers began to organize, but struggled with Unitarian and Universalist theologies that did seem heretical, and thus they did not include either association in their circle of national churches. Now you can imagine that the Universalists and the Unitarians were none too pleased that they were excluded from the very movement that they'd centered themselves around. In 1915, Universalist minister Clarence Skinner wrote The Social Implications of Universalism, outlining clearly how we understand our mission in the world and throwing a little shade at those who he describes as coming late to what has always been true about Universalism. Meanwhile, John Haynes Holmes, a Unitarian, puts his faith into action, becoming the president of the ACLU and helping to co-found the NAACP. Holmes was a pacifist, and he left the Unitarians when the American Unitarian Association, or AUA, required ministers to pledge support for World War I, although his congregation, the Community Church of New York, remained a member, and eventually Holmes came back. But it is in these years that our Unitarian theological circle begins to expand, because they begin to understand that if there is one God, perhaps we don't have the only description of what God means or how God is experienced. And the Universalist circle expands too, for if all are saved, perhaps it doesn't actually require belief in Jesus as Savior or even a recognition of Jesus at all. The theological circles expand. And then comes World War I. After the war comes a time of some prosperity, but also a time when people seek more certain answers from their religion, and both Unitarianism and Universalism begin to decline. The two associations begin to talk about a merger, but there are big doctrinal differences that keep us apart. At the same time, those who are leaving religion altogether begin to realize that they need not religious supernaturalism, but a religious humanism. Curtis Reese and John Dietrich start articulating religious humanism with the idea that you don't have to let go of belief in God, but that God is in our interactions with each other and our care for each other. And that if God is love, that love is expressed in the ways that we are with one another. Meanwhile, over in Europe, Norbert Topek, a former Baptist minister, finds that he is actually a Unitarian. He founds a church in Prague where many refugees from Catholicism and other religions gather. As Chopek stewards this congregation, he creates a ritual that is based on the ideas of communion, but is not communion, but rather a flower ceremony, with the first one being held in June of 1923. Also in the late 1920s, Sophia Lyon-Fahs becomes the head of religious education at the American Unitarian Association, changing forever how we think about Sunday school and faith formation in our congregations. Now, as the tide turns in Europe, it becomes clear that the focus on the human condition requires statements of purpose. And in 1933, with a number of Unitarian ministers writing and signing on, the first Humanist Manifesto is published. Humanist thought catches fire in both Unitarianism and Universalism. As a result of this shared focus, the Unitarians and the Universalists published their first joint hymnal, Hymns for the Spirit, for use in the free churches in America. Yet even a clear expression of humanism in the free churches cannot stop good people from falling into the traps of the culture in which they swim. Racism rears its ugly head, especially in Unitarianism, where Black ministers like Egbert Ethelred Brown are told they cannot found Unitarian congregations and will not have funding for the work they do. And while the Great Depression and Jim Crow flourish in the States, fascism begins to flourish in Europe. Back in Prague, Čapek becomes a vocal opponent of the Nazi movement, and by the early 1940s finds himself and his daughter imprisoned in concentration camps. In 1942, Čapek is murdered at Dachau. Meanwhile, his wife Maya has fled to New York and seeks refuge with All Souls Church. She brings the flower ceremony, which, of course, becomes a significant ritual in our own faith. Two other big things of note during the Second World War. First, Reverend Wakefield Sharp and his wife Martha left their children behind in the care of the parish and boldly committed to multiple life-threatening missions in Europe. Beginning in 1939, Sharp and his wife administered relief to hundreds of endangered Jews and other refugees in Prague. In the following year, they traveled to southern Europe to continue a relief and rescue program for endangered refugees as representatives of the newly formed Unitarian Service Committee. Second, the new Unitarian Service Committee commissioned a new logo from artist Hans Deutsch in 1941. What he devised was a flaming chalice. After the war, Clinton Lee Scott, a Universalist minister from Utica, New York, and signer of the first Humanist Manifesto, starts the Church of the Larger Fellowship, with its initial mission to support military personnel around the world. In 1953, it is the youth who bring the Unitarians and the Universalists together as they form joint organizations for our youth and young adults. And the theological circles keep expanding. For Unitarians, if there is one God and that God is experienced in many ways, perhaps there is not any one rule for who is right or who is wrong about the afterlife. For Universalists, if all are saved and it isn't dependent on belief in Jesus, then perhaps there is just one God for all of us. As the circles begin growing even larger, it becomes clear that what matters most is not what we believe happens when we die, but what happens while we are alive. What matters most is the human condition, how we are with each other. Social action becomes the inextricable consequence of these two circles that have grown so large that they include each other. By 1956, the American Unitarian Association and the Universalist Church of America created a joint merger commission. And while there were practical and financial reasons to consolidate resources, the theological, spiritual, and ethical reasons made consolidation of the Unitarians and the Universalists both logical and inevitable. In 1961, in Syracuse, New York, we became Syracuse Orange fans. No. In Syracuse, the consolidation is signed and the first General Assembly of the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations is held. Unitarian Dana Greeley is the controversial first president. The symbol of this new faith is two interlocking circles. And now we're off to the races. In 1964, the first truly Unitarian Universalist hymnal, Hymns for the Celebration of Life, is published. And as we watch the civil rights movement grow, we understand ourselves not just as a religion, but as a religion committed to social justice. And many seminarians, ministers, and lay leaders go to Selma in 1965. Two of our own, Reverend James Reeb and Viola Liuzzo, lose their lives. By 1968, it was time for us to wrestle with racism in our organization. The Black Affairs Council, or BAC, was formed, and the General Assembly voted to fund the BAC, including establishing Kwanzaa as a holiday of our faith. But the UUA was broke and spent the entire $8 million unrestricted endowment that was earmarked for BAC on other things. In 1969, the Reverend Jack Mendelson of the BAC led a walkout, and the UUA almost comes apart. This was an ugly time in our history and our country, but we persevered. In 1972, Beacon Press published the Pentagon Papers, which revealed much about the Vietnam War. In 1975, the UUA created the Office of Bisexual, Gay, Lesbian, and Transgender Concerns. In 1976, the flaming chalice first appears as a symbol of the UUA on the title page of our directory. In 1977, a resolution of Women in Religion is adopted, calling on the UUA and individual congregations to examine gender role stereotypes. During the 1980s, the ritual lighting of the chalice in a worship service becomes a widespread practice. In 1985, the Statements of Principles and Purposes is revised and adopted. Our statement of principles for the first time included women, and there was a charge from the president to create a more inclusive hymnal. In 1993, we published Singing the Living Tradition. In 1995, the General Assembly adds a sixth source and a seventh principle, the earth-based traditions and the interdependent web of all existence. By 1996, the UUA publicly supports full marriage equality. Reverend Bill Sinkford, the first African-American president of the UUA, officiates the first legal same-sex marriage in the United States in 2004. In 2005, we published Singing the Journey, adding some of the songs that were left out of Celebration of Life, but that we still loved. It also included some new songs commonly sung among us and songs for the earth-based traditions. In 2012, accessibility becomes a deep concern at Justice GA in Phoenix, Arizona, where we faced off with then Sheriff Joe Arpaio. The movement we call Standing on the Side of Love changes its name in response to Side with Love. In 2017, we face a hiring controversy, which reveals our struggles still around transparency, race, misogyny, and the Old Boys Club. Then President Peter Morales and other UUA employees resign. 3 co-presidents hold the fort: Reverend Dr. Sophia Betancourt, Dr. Leon Spencer, and the Reverend Bill Sinkford. In the midst of this controversy, we take on white supremacy teach-ins in our congregations, and the General Assembly makes a promise to Black Lives of UU, or Blue, to raise $5 million. At that same General Assembly, Susan Frederick Gray is elected as the first female president of the UUA. In 2019, we fulfill our promise to Blue and made our goal of $5 million. In 2020, facing a global pandemic, our congregations move online, something unimaginable even 2 or 3 years before. Holding 2 General Assemblies virtually was necessary and a sea change. As I record this in April of 2023, we face a new election for UUA president and a great deal of unknown in our congregations and in our movement. We don't know for sure what's next. I mean, every time we think we did something right and good, something else comes to challenge the limits of what we mean when we say no one is outside the circle of concern. Who else is out there, and how can our faith be liberative so that we don't even need circles anymore? This is our call. This has been an incomplete and utter history of Unitarian Universalism. I'm the Reverend Kimberly Davis. Thanks for watching.